It's the Leading on Purpose podcast, helping leaders, teams, and organizations lead more intentionally, effectively, and with purpose. Welcome back to the Leading on Purpose podcast. Doug and I are back with yet another episode today, and we're excited to talk you through the concept and some ideas around emotional intelligence. Doug, thanks again for being with me. Appreciate you joining the podcast.
Oh, as always, my pleasure, John. Good to be with you.
So, emotional intelligence. What a big topic. We don't like easy conversations, do we?
We certainly don't. I don't know if that speaks to our level of emotional intelligence or not.
That could be the case. Yeah. So, why this topic? It's been around for quite a while. It's not a new idea or a new concept. But Doug, why do you think it's so important to maybe talk our audience through the ideas and the skills within this giant bucket called emotional intelligence?
Yeah, John, for me, when I think back on all my experience and years of being involved in leadership roles inside organizations, consulting, if someone were to ask me, is there one particular topic that has just been fundamentally so important, at least in the span of time that I've been involved in this work, what would that topic be? And I'd have no hesitation in saying emotional intelligence. I think it is the key to success of leaders. And as we go along in our conversation today, we'll talk about it's not the singular success for leaders, but it's in my mind the most significant. And I think in my own journey with emotional intelligence, but especially in working with other leaders and helping them hone their emotional intelligence, there's a lot of elements of emotional intelligence that I think are a bit underappreciated and even misunderstood. I mean, I can't tell you how many times over the years I'll have a conversation with someone. If the topic of emotional intelligence comes up, I'll hear somebody say something, the essence of, oh, well, that's about being nice to people. It's like, well, it's not really. Now, is being nice to people, does that fit under this umbrella of emotional intelligence? It does, but it's so much more, and it's so deeper and richer than that. So it was fun for me to think about our conversation today, because this topic is one that I think is just so critically important for not just leaders, but our relationships with human beings. Yeah. No matter what role you're in, emotional intelligence is there. So looking forward to see where this takes us today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'd be hard pressed to think of a set of skills that are more important for leaders to consider than the skills that we'll walk through that underpin this giant bucket that is emotional intelligence. I've always considered it really the differentiator between maybe a decent leader who's technically proficient, has the years of experience. It's the difference maker for a leader who brings those levels of expertise and experience to the table versus someone who has mastered emotional intelligence. It takes a good leader to great, in my observation and in my own experience, because I think both of us have probably had our bouts with emotional intelligence. I know for me, and I've seen this happen with leaders that I've worked with over the years, but it certainly happened in my journey, is almost this moment in your career where you can feel like the rug was pulled out from underneath you. And you work hard, you come out of school with a particular set of ideas around what it's like to step into the working environment, what skills will be required, how I go about developing myself. And if you're not careful and you're not paying close attention to how your behaviors resonate or maybe don't resonate with those around you, it's very easy to get laser focused on real tangible hard skills. And yes. So that's where you devote a lot of your time and resources when it comes to developing yourself. What workshop can I go to? What technical certifications can I get myself signed up for? How to become a master in the field of work that I've chosen. And I know for me, all of a sudden, faced with this moment where I was provided some real tough feedback that, hey, you're not resonating with your team. And this unnamed thing kind of brought to the forefront of
Right.
just,
Yep.
you've spent all this time working on these other areas of intelligence, but emotional intelligence didn't get enough attention along the way. And
Yep.
again, I know I've seen that with leaders that I've worked with as well, particularly in fields that are very technically related, where an individual can make it a long way on technical expertise almost alone. And so it can feel like this abrupt moment in your career when you're faced with, okay, why isn't my leadership working? Why can't I outthink the leadership issues I'm having with my team? And it's this whole different set of skills that easily missed, easily glossed over.
I love the term you just used, kind of outthink this issue. And for me, it's you and I have talked in our prior conversations about some of the coaching work that we do, and I can't tell you, and I'll bet your experience is the same. How many leaders you work with that are maybe struggling in role, or maybe are feeling they're just not as successful as what they could be. And sometimes that lack of success is they haven't been promoted to that next level or whatever it is. And they're searching for that answer. It's like, what, I'm bright, I'm smart, I've got all this experience. And it's always about the emotional intelligence and relationships. And it's so sometimes that discovery process for folks is just the first step is even understanding what is emotional intelligence and why is it so damn important?
Yeah.
Because why haven't I heard about it before? I went through school, and by the way, I think one of the things that not just business schools but other schools and in universities are doing so much better job is integrating emotional intelligence development into their curriculum. But back in the day, when I was getting my undergraduate degree, the book Emotional Intelligence hadn't even been published yet. It was still about 10 years from being published.
Yeah.
And it was all about the technicalities of business and maybe a little bit of management sprinkled in there, but management from a systemic standpoint and how to organize processes and but no mention of this human element. So I think more and more people are understanding the concept of emotional intelligence, but I certainly came up in my career with a generation that this was new stuff.
Yeah.
And once people learn about it and hear about it, they're like, "Oh, it makes such total sense." But it can be frustrating to folks because, again, I love your expression, "Outthink it." You can't outthink it. This is a way of being. It's not what you know; it's who you are and how you relate to people that makes the critical difference.
Yep. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. When it was finally first published, which I think you have to look back to kind of the mid 90s,
Right.
gentleman by the name of Daniel Goleman, and all credit to Daniel Goleman, who continues to do, I think, amazing research on the topic. He didn't really invent the term emotional intelligence, but I think he really brought it into the mainstream. And I read a blurb just not too long ago that was kind of interesting. It wasn't well accepted even at the time, even with all the research that he put into his initial book around emotional intelligence. I read a blurb that said even his publishers and marketers said you can't put the word emotion in a business book. What are
Mm,
you doing? And so it's really kind of a radical way of thinking. And yeah, you just fast forward to today. I can't imagine. It's kind of the ante to get in the game is to
right.
have a leader who emotionally resonates with people.
Yeah.
And so how far we've come. Here's the other interesting thing to me. I think it's more important than it has ever been to focus on the skills that underpin this, again, this big idea of emotional intelligence. And for me, it's all the research I've been doing recently around AI, artificial intelligence. And just, there's a lot of fears out there right now around job replacement, what these machines are capable of doing.
Mm.
And you take your average role within an organization, and a typical job description in a role for the last 20, 25 years is to solve problems. look at information, disseminate that information, interpret that information, and then suggest a solution and implement the solution. Well, we're getting to a place now where a machine can do a lot of that in a fraction of the time. What's interesting is here's what a machine can't do. When it comes to implementing that solution, manage the change around it, manage the mood within the organization. I think another good example that I've read about is a doctor. Certainly, AI can do some amazing things in terms of diagnosing and prescribing solutions for people's health problems. But the article I read talked about who's going to sit down with the family and say, "Hey, here's what we're facing. How's it going? What do you need?"
That's interesting.
And so I think emotional intelligence, despite the threat of artificial intelligence, is more important than it's ever been, because it's the one differentiator between us, and I don't want to sound apocalyptic, but the rise of these machines around us.
Yeah. That's an interesting insight. And maybe that's the good news in all of this, that human element is always going to be there and it's always going to be needed. And no matter how technologically advanced we become as a society, it's all about human connection. And so great insight.
Yeah.
So, John, for our listeners that maybe are like, okay, so you've used this term emotional intelligence a few times, and it sounds like it's a pretty good thing. What exactly is this? So maybe just we'll spend a few minutes just, I don't know if define is the right word, but get a sense of what emotional intelligence is all about, if that's all right with you.
Yeah.
So, in defining emotional intelligence, one of the things I like to do with individuals is they're just kind of dipping their toe in the water and first understanding it, is have them relate it to their own experience in life rather than just handing them a definition.
Yeah.
And so, one of the conversations I love to have either with individuals or groups of people is just to get them to think about the best boss that they've ever worked for.
Love that exercise, by the
And
way.
I mean, ooh, just now when I state, I'm getting just literally chills myself, because in my mind's eye, I have these wonderful human beings that I've just been so blessed to have in my life that were just great leaders. But the question then becomes, specifically, what made them such a good leader for you? What trait or characteristic? And just write down, 3 or 4 of those that are just top of mind for you when you think of that person. What's there for you? And then after I'll jot those down, I'll ask them to think about, and when you were in a relationship with this person, receiving their leadership, what were some of the typical emotions that you experienced? How did you feel being in a relationship with them? And boy, the pens just fly, or the conversation comes very easily. And then sometimes, not always, because it's kind of going to the darker side and kind of sucks the energy right out of the conversation, is that people think about the worst bosses they've ever had. And unfortunately, for most people, it doesn't take a whole lot of digging to come up with those names. And it's the same kind of questioning around, why didn't that person resonate for me? Use that word resonate earlier. What traits or characteristics were an issue for me? And what was the emotional response that I would have to this person? And so they write these things down, and then we just start to process the list, especially the list of the really good leaders. And back in the day, one of the researchers, psychologists from Harvard, David McClellan,
Yeah.
who did a lot of early work on motivational theory and competencies. And as he would do similar exercises with individuals, he started to notice patterns. And when he would look at the list that people would generate, they seem to fit in kind of 3 buckets, for lack of a better term. One bucket is kind of the cognitive thinking skills of folks, the analytical abilities. Again, to your point, I can think my way through this. And by the way, cognitive abilities are important to have as a leader.
Absolutely.
You do have to have a level of cognitive thinking and processing to do this. And then you think about the technical skills needed to do the work, right? That varies depending on the profession you're in. Sometimes it's a certain degree or a certification or whatever it might be. But then there were a lot of other things still on the table that hadn't been put in a bucket. And as you start to notice it, they were human relations elements, either my relationships with other people or even how that leader managed themselves, their level of self control, the empathy that they have with other human beings. And so he started to think about these three different buckets: the cognitive abilities, the technical skills, and then the human relation skills that Dan Goldman, who you referred to a bit ago, coined the term emotional intelligence. And then to take it a step further, he started thinking about the relative importance of each of these characteristics. And so, John, and I know you've done this exercise with leaders as well. You then ask them to take a look at the list of the words or the words that they had just mentioned in conversation about their best leader, and you ask them, where do the majority of those words fit? And rarely, if ever, will someone say, well, most of the traits and characteristics of my best boss were all technical skills or all cognitive skills. They look at their list and go, oh my gosh, all, or maybe nearly all, of the things about this leader that so resonated with me were the human relation skills.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what McClelland and Goldman and others consistently find in their research with emotional intelligence, these human relation skills, is they tend to be twice as important as the combined cognitive and technical skills. So again, it doesn't mean you don't need the cognitive and technical skills. I always like to refer to that as kind of your ticket to entry to get in the door. If I'm going to lead an operation, there's a certain level of technical expertise and knowledge I need to have to function.
Yeah.
But what's really going to be called upon for me as a leader, and what's going to really tip the scales and whether or not I'm successful, is the emotional intelligence, the relationship skills that I, day in, day out, that I bring to the table. And that pattern is found across industries, organizations. It's just so consistent that the hallmark of highly successful leaders is this thing called emotional intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the exercise you mentioned, I use that tactic a lot in one-to-ones and certainly in group settings to talk about best boss, worst boss. The other thing I notice is typically the difference between the two lists as people, again, look at that list of behaviors and characteristics they have listed out, is it's the way they were made to feel.
Yes.
And so even if it was a moment they were being taught something or delegated to, it was, how did the leader make me feel during that experience? It's really what they're calling out on that list. And it's fascinating to me because feelings, well, that's emotions. And it's about how a leader resonates for you. The other thing I think is interesting on the less fun list to make, which is worst boss characteristics, is how oftentimes there's some insight there around, up until this point, John, I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong in that scenario with that leader. And just making this list makes it clearer for me why it didn't work for me. And so it is interesting to me when we think about emotional intelligence, it can be this mysterious thing for people. Something's off. It's not sitting well in my gut, and I can't figure out what it is in this relationship. And I think that happens professionally and personally for people. Something's just off there. And typically what I notice, it's something related to emotional intelligence or sadly a lack thereof.
Well, it's we've all seen the studies that are published out there about why people leave their jobs. Yeah. And at the top of that list, just about everyone that you see, it's relationship with boss. And I know that's true for me. I left one organization for certain, and I'd say even a second organization, it was part of it. I enjoyed the work I was doing and the industry it was in. It's just like I had just grown tired of the poor leadership that I was receiving, and just the draining. It was just draining to be in the relationship, and especially If you're responsible for a team of people and you as a leader aren't in a good place with your leader and their lack of emotion, and it's having an impact on you, you got to work your tail off to buffer and shelter the people that report to you. Because if I'm miserable in my job, if I'm feeling that from my boss, that lack of connection, that lack of energy, boy, it takes a lot then for me to show up in an effective way for the people I lead. And you just, at least for me personally, I just got to a point sometimes in my career said I just can't do this anymore. It's just it's too hard.
Yeah.
And you get out of it.
Yeah. So I think, one of my calls to action to our listeners would be emotional intelligence is not a nice to have. It's not something at the bottom of a 10 item priority list that when I have time, I'll walk around and lead people and be emotionally intelligent. It really does need to be incorporated, kind of soup to nuts in terms of your behaviors and relationships with people in the workplace. And yeah, all the research that you mentioned that's been done around why people leave organizations. I probably mentioned it before, but one of my favorite research studies, because it was done by Gallup, and in my mind, there's probably no better polling organization on the planet than Gallup. 2020, 2021, they did their largest ever global workforce study, and their goal was to really try to distill down the big notions around the word engagement. Because you say the word engagement, or we're going to do an engagement survey in our organization, that can be kind of alarming, jarring, scary for a leader to think about. It's a big word. How do I fix engagement? And so in their book, they did, all this research. It's a phone book of all their research, distilling down the notion of engagement down to its simplest terms. And the title of the book, it's The Manager.
Mm.
And so all this research, what they discovered, it's the relationship with the boss that plays the heaviest hand in how I'm feeling on a day-to-day basis. And to your point, Doug, ultimately what could drive me to walk away from a great role, from a great opportunity is a poor relationship with that leader. So it's not a nice to have, folks. It's must have.
Yeah, it's so true, and it's so powerful. And I mean, even if you've had the experience, and I've had this as well, and John, I know you have as well during your career. Let's say that you're not in a great relationship with the boss, and there's a leadership change. You get a new boss. I mean, so I'm doing the same job. It's the same team of people, and all of a sudden, this new human being shows up and leads in a different way, brings emotional intelligence to it. It is amazing to me how quick that transformation of a team can be in terms of productivity, energy, the discretionary effort that they have. It's absolutely amazing. And it works in the other way too. A
Yeah.
leader that is just so good at this and so connected to the people. And then all of a sudden a leadership change and somebody comes in and it's not there. And it's just like, oh, this because when you've been to the good place,
Yeah.
then when you're asked to all of a sudden like, oh, this is not so good. So it's all about the manager and their relationship with folks. It is so terribly important.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay. Well, how do
and I was
we?
thinking about
Yeah. Go ahead.
our prior conversations around even the skill of coaching and the coaching leadership style that we talked about. So if you've had a chance to listen to those episodes, this hopefully will make sense. And if not, they'd be great to go back and take another listen to. Is the skills that we talked about with coaching are all wrapped up in this thing called emotional intelligence. You cannot use the coaching leadership style without emotional intelligence. And I've seen leaders do it. They've read the book, they know the technique, they know the words to say when they're coaching, they know the framework and the model. But boy, if there's not that relationship and trust with someone, it's just not gonna work
Yep.
very well. So I don't know what your thoughts are about that, but I just, as we're having this conversation, I can't help but go back to our prior conversations around that coaching leadership style.
Well, even all the leadership styles, in the research and in our own observation, it's why certain leadership styles work and others don't. Is what's the degree of emotional intelligence required for this leadership style? Well, not coincidentally, coaching relies on high levels of emotional resonance for it to work. And so you're absolutely right. It's all, coaching is all connected, and emotional intelligence is wrapped into, what you and I would define as an effective coaching
Yep.
conversation. It's well beyond the technique of it. And it's how are you going to resonate in the relationship with this other person? Which leads me to one important thing before we kind of get to the skills, because we've talked about self-awareness, relationship management. I think we owe it to folks to kind of frame this up. What are we talking about when we talk about the various competencies underneath the idea of emotional intelligence? I think it's also interesting to think about what precedes emotional intelligence. And so as you were describing coaching and how to show up in those conversations, to me, one of the things that has to precede our work on our own emotional intelligence is authenticity. And we can't use emotional intelligence as a tool, because when we talk about these competencies, there is a version of emotional intelligence that's actually, I would classify it as being manipulative, where, boy, I know if I hear this person's story out and I display empathy, that once we get to the other side of that, we can get what I want out of the situation. And sadly, if you did that consciously, by the way, you got maybe a whole nother set of problems.
Right.
But unfortunately for a lot of leaders, that is subconscious. That if we're so focused on our own objectives, what we want to achieve, and we've had maybe a few moments of success by hearing someone out or talking about the ball game, or having a conversation that's maybe broader than just work and tasks, subconsciously leaders can file that away as, okay, that's a means to an end now. I can use emotional intelligence as a tool to maybe get what I want out of the conversation. And to me, that goes against the notion of authenticity. And so as you think about our definition here that we'll outline for emotional intelligence and the competencies underneath it, get real clear on your intentions and find your own authenticity, because I also think everyone's version of emotional intelligence is unique to them.
Yes.
And so it's just a big piece I like to think about. The one other thing I'll mention, and then Doug, I want to start framing this up for people in terms of these emotional intelligence competencies we've been alluding to. The other thing that precedes it is, and I heard Simon Sinek not too long ago talk about this, and it just rang really true as I thought about emotional intelligence, is a desire and motivation to change. And so as you explore your own emotional intelligence, and one of the first things it starts with is really our own self-awareness, a good, long, hard look in the mirror, as they say, you don't really get to master some of the competencies of emotional intelligence unless you have the desire to change, do something with that information that's coming back at you in the mirror. And so just a couple thoughts on maybe some things to wrap your head around that precede exercising some of these competencies. Great news for all of you is emotional intelligence, I think, is often misconstrued or misunderstood as something that people are just natural at. It is a skill. It is a set of skills that you can work on. And so I think it's just another bit of good news as we talk about emotional intelligence defined.
Yes. Yeah, that John, that idea of wanting to change. And I know my own life's journey, when I've been in those moments where for a variety of reasons, I've gained awareness of the need to change. You've got to connect, I think, very sincerely to that motivation and the why. It's, it hasn't happened a lot over the years, but with the coaching clients that I've been privileged to work with, every once in a while, someone will show up in a coaching relationship because they're supposed to. My boss said I ought to have a coach, or what, and most generally, if you spend some time with them and again bring emotional intelligence to a coaching conversation, they'll start to open up and be vulnerable, and you start to really get an understanding of why is this important to them. But the reality is, those times where the coaching hasn't gone terribly well, or maybe it's just even ended, many times it's because there isn't that clear sense of purpose and motivation, and why is this important. And that's true for leaders in the workplace in terms of getting the results. It could be true in a personal relationship you have with someone. So I love that you brought that forward. Is a fundamental, is just really understanding what's my why, what's my motivation, am I open to change, because emotional intelligence can be developed, but it it has to be very intentional, and someone has to really want to go there and work on it.
Yeah, and
You
that's
know,
where that desire and motivation to me connect with your authenticity. You have to genuinely want to work on it. It can't your motivation can't be because you're staring down negative circumstances. Hey, I'm going to be out of a
like,
job. I'm on a performance improvement plan. If I don't, that if that's your driving force, you're not going to find a lot of success
yep.
developing yourself on these competencies because it just won't last if you're not really bought in. And to your point, Doug, you haven't found your own why, your own purpose behind doing so. And that's a wrap for part 1 of Doug and I defining emotional intelligence. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks so much for tuning in.